Ever since I stopped playing Terror decks, I've been on Dragapult, and I kind of like the guy. And moving forward, I'm gonna keep liking the guy. I think it's a really good deck. However, that's where my point kind of diverges from it being a really good deck. So, when we talk about Dragapult, you never know what deck I'm talking about. I might be talking about Dragapult Dusknoir, Dragapult Straight Dragapult, or Dragapult Charizard, right? There's many versions of the deck, and those are kind of the three popular ones. However, I kind of want to take it upon myself to try and popularize a few more. And I think right now, there's definitely a few candidates for things that Dragapult could be seen with. So obviously, I have been playing that Dragapult Zoroark deck, and Zoroark I think is a really good out to beating the God of War matchup, and that's kind of the main thing you struggle with right now, beating God of War. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's talk about why I think Dragapult is just so damn good. Well, I think that's because of this guy, right? Obviously, it's a built-in draw engine, which lets you look at the top two cards of your deck, put one into your hand, and put the other at the bottom of the deck. And you might argue that Trade would be a better ability because you discard a card that you don't want to use, and then you draw two more cards. However, I think that might have a bit of a drawback, and it also means that Dragapult lets itself build like decks in a way that you wouldn't be able to with Refinement. For example, God of War was so good with Refinement because you wanted to discard energies. Zoroark, the trade Zoroark, was really good because, well, for example, the current Zoroark, you also want to discard energy for End's Point Up, but you also play a lot of different techs for specific matchups. For example, if you're not playing against something like Goldengo, you don't really need your 2-1 line of Toadscruel, so you kind of discard those tech cards. Whereas Dragapult, it doesn't have as many tech cards as these other decks. So you kind of want to keep a lot of these cards, and the nice thing is it lets you stack your deck in a way with Recon Directive the same way it would with Iona. You put cards at the bottom of your deck. So towards the mid to later stages of the game, where your deck is kind of, let's say, 20 cards, every time you look at, you use Recon Directive, you're seeing 10% of your deck. So that means you're putting one card into your hand and one card at the bottom of the deck. And if you're Iono, it means this card is being pushed up to the top of the deck. So every time you use Recon Directive, and every time you end up using your Iono, you keep pushing cards to the top of your deck. So you can kind of stack your deck. You can see a boss, and let's say you know you'll need boss in maybe 2 turns, and you can now put that card to the bottom of the deck, and know that in 2 Ionos, you'll be able to see that boss. And for example, with Pheasantipity always drawing 3 cards, you'll be able to get that card a lot sooner, and honestly, whenever you really need it. You just need to keep track of where that card is in your deck, which just gives this deck a lot more flexibility and a lot more outplay potential. So you can really take advantage of Recon Directive being such a good ability. However, obviously right now, Dragapult might not be in the best state. Obviously, we kind of look at things like the God of War matchup being not so good, and maybe the Kangaskhan matchup being not so good. But that's where I think cards can come in. And honestly, this is where Dragapult becomes a little bit of a better deck because of this flexibility. Obviously, you do need Fire and Psychic to attack with Dragapult, but that can be solved with your upper energy and things like Luminous Energy. So you might be thinking, what cards am I actually thinking of including in Dragapult? Well, first things first, I think Greninja EX is just a pretty underappreciated card. Not only is the artwork hella sick, look at this dude, he's also like a frog, like hello? A frog? Do we not all love frogs? I love frogs. But anyway, besides the point. I think Greninja is an underappreciated card. 170 damage, search your deck for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. It's doing 170, which is great because that means we're doing 340 into something like a Kangaskhan. And with Lively Stadium in play, that's knocking it out, right? However, if they have something like a Berry Charm, then you kind of need to do a little bit more damage. But we obviously will be playing Jamming Towers to bump those kinds of stadiums and turn those tools off to be able to hit this higher number and be able to KO things like the Kangaskhan. And not only are you taking a 3-prize knockout, you are also then just searching your deck for a card. And if your opponent doesn't Iono you, then you get to keep that card. So not only are we helping our own consistency, we're also being able to like now knock out these cards that are weak to fighting, which it is a fighting type. However, obviously, it is weak to Psychic, and that is a big problem because obviously our God of War matchup already isn't great. But now, for example, we can just completely kind of sacrifice the God of War matchup and then just move into the being able to beat these other other kinds of mega decks. And Greninja itself has a pretty decent second attack. Discard 2 energy from this Pokemon, and it does 120 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. Any of your opponent's Pokemon, which is pretty damn good. Obviously, Shaman is in the format, but not many people are playing Shaman. For example, if we're able to set this up in something like the Mirror Match, imagine just taking out 2 of your opponent's Dracloaks. It's pretty strong. And now we can include a card such as, for example, Ignition Energy, and it's only 2 attachments where you can attach manually to Greninja once, and then your next attach is the Ignition Energy, discard that Ignition Energy, and do 120 to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon, or just any of your opponent's Pokemon, which is obviously really, really nice. So why is this card not included? Like I said, I think it's because of the Gardevoir right now, and that's honestly the main reason it has kind of been written off. However, I think it could be a decent tech, especially if you kind of find a way to solve the Gardevoir matchup. Maybe you do play one of those Zoroarks to kind of help that matchup, because that Zoroark already uses the Ignition Energy, and Mirage Barrage will also use Ignition Energy. And then if you're able to build a deck like that, you have a really solid draw engine that's able to power you up, and a great attacker that can already beat a lot of these other decks in the game. And then you'll have Greninja, which is also a decent attacker with Shiny Blade. It can kind of put on pressure with Mirage Barrage, and then also an attacker that's able to deal with Gardevoir. Obviously, that being said, very easy. However, making that happen is nowhere near as easy. And another potential partner would be Mega Kangaskhan EX. You might be thinking, well, why Mega Kangaskhan EX? Why not just, use Badoo? Well, Run Errand is just such a good ability that it just lets you draw 2 cards in the beginning of your turn, right? And then on top of Dracloaks and that kind of stuff, you just have an even better draw engine. So now if we're able to use something like a Crispin, we can now power up our Dragapult whenever we want it, and also kind of just power up our rapid fire combo. We can obviously use our TM Energize if we'd like, or even TM Evo to evolve into our Dracloaks. So it's also a really big 300 HP Pokemon, so we can kind of build the deck in a more controlling way with cards like Penny, cards like Bravery Charm, or cards like Airy that lets us look at our opponent's hand and discard 2 items that we find there. For example, against Goldengo, we can discard 2 of the Superior Energy Retrievals, and from there, it's very difficult for them to deal with something like a Mega Kangaskhan that has 350 HP, because not only do they have to discard 7 energy to KO it, they also need to have 1 energy attached on their Pokemon. So it means they need 8 energy. And if we increase this HP further by using something like a Lively Stadium, that means we have 380 HP, meaning Goldengo now needs to discard 8 energy and another 1 on the attach. So that's a lot of energy needed to discard to knock out 1 Pokemon. Obviously, they're getting 3 prize cards for it, but we can kind of force them to go through a Mega Kangaskhan and then go through 2 Dragapults. And that's not easy, especially when Dragapult in itself is such an oppressive attacker that just puts you on a clock. Dragapult has such a strong attack, and especially when you pair that with Rapid Fire combo, we can be swinging into something like a, let's say for example, a Fezandipity. We can take 200 damage, even if we don't flip the heads. We don't have to flip the heads. Sometimes we might even not want to flip the heads anyway. We can swing 200, they take a knockout, and now our Ionos are a lot stronger because we can Iona them to 3 all the time, and on top of that, we can take very free knockouts with Phantom Dive. Sure, they'll be able to knock out our Dragapult after that, but then what are they going to do after that? They knock out our Dragapult, we have another one coming right back in and probably going to be closing out the game right there. And this will also help something like the Gardevoir matchup, because Gardevoir doesn't actually have a great way around Mega Kangaskhan. Sure, they might have Drifloon, but if we end up playing something like a Tool Scrapper, we can kill that Drifloon very easily, and then after that, just chase down other things with Phantom Dive and take a multi-prize turn, even a 4-prize turn after they took a 3-prize turn. And even if they do KO our Dragapult, we'll have 1 more. And usually they'll have to put Elise Clefairy into play. And if they put Elise Clefairy into play, it's pretty easy for us to knock it out with Dragapult. We just need a Boss's Orders or a Counter Catcher at that point. So I think Kangaskhan actually does help out, not only with the draw power, the attack is also really good in itself, but also it being worth 3 prize cards is honestly pretty nice, because being put on 3 prize cards means that our Counter Catchers and Ionos are going to have a lot more effect throughout the entire game. Like, even if we do take a 2-prize knockout, we don't get punished by not having access to counter catcher, because our opponents will still be on 3 price cards while we're on 4 price cards. And then after that, when they end up taking a knockout on our Dragapult, they'll go down to 1 price card, which means we'll have access to counter catcher throughout the rest of the game. And in that kind of a board state, we can play something like Acerta's Mischief, which will make our Dragapult EX invulnerable to any attacks from EXs. So I'm sure we can set up a lot of these checkmate scenarios with Mega Kangaskhan and Dragapult, just because of how much draw you have and how oppressive the deck actually would be. For example, if we're able to get an early rapid fire combo off, we could usually maybe get 2 to 3 of these things off before Mega Kangaskhan actually goes down. And if Kang is able to take out 3 prize cards while we're just setting up our board state behind it, well, it's probably going to be very difficult for our opponent to actually go for a board wipe, because there's a good chance we'll just set up our Dragapults behind it. This deck will play very similar to something like an Arceus Duraludon, where we have our Arceus setting up our 2 Duraludons, Arceus goes down, but our opponent still has to go through these other guys. And playing cards like Penny and Toro, we can pick up liabilities. For example, we can put down Pheasantipity, use it, pick it back up. Or something like an Ursaluna. If we aren't able to set up 2 Dragapults, we can bench an Ursaluna, and then force our opponent to go through, well, a just big, beefy 2 prizer as well. They have to go through 3 of them, except one of them is a 3 prizer with 300 HP. So I think this deck definitely has some kind of viability to it. I have made a few rough drafts of the deck, and it's been pretty fun. It's definitely been fun, and I have been winning a few games. The only thing I can't really solve right now, the Goldango matchup isn't great. I haven't been trying to like fix it very much because I cut the Aries and stuff. But you know, 100 likes and I'll release a video on that deck in itself. But yeah, thanks for watching. Peace.